We don't need to say that the origins of Islam are controversial. The origins of any religion are controversial, since adherents will invariably make claims for their religion that people outside the religion will reject or at least question. And for most religions, the point of origin is claimed to be some encounter with the divine. Indeed, religions and revelations typically begin with theophany, some divine intrusion into the human order. Islam is certainly no different. Its origins, spiritually speaking, are in angelic annunciation, the angelic vision. An angel spoke to a man. In Christianity, an angel spoke to a woman. The Christian revelation, properly speaking, begins when the angel appeared to Mary. In Judaism, God himself spoke to a man from a burning bush. In such stories, the mortal world and the divine world momentarily overlap, and the religion that follows clings to this extraordinary conjunction in a quest for sanctity and grace. Such accounts, we might say, are sacred history, and in the religious perspective, by definition, this overshadows all other considerations. It is a transcendent truth to which more ordinary truths must concede as a matter of priority. This impacts especially the story world in which such religions take shape. Every religion begins as a buzz in the story world. The story world is that fluid, shifting, metamorphizing realm of narrative, old and new, in which all human beings are embedded. Needless to say, oral, pre-literate cultures have very different, richer story worlds than literate cultures. But even in literate cultures, the story world is essentially oral. Therefore, the formative processes that shape a religion in this way are, for the most part, hidden and unrecorded. There are forces and ideas, motifs, themes that circulate through the story world, but which necessarily leave no trace as they travel. In the case of the major religions, world religions, what happens is that a certain configuration of elements congeal into a viable form. A religion is a cosmos, that is, a coherent universe of ideas. A cosmos forms in the story world. The various elements that congeal are not random. They constitute an ordered system that is, most essentially, metaphysically cogent. We should think of it as an organic process, but at the same time crystalline, because religions crystallize, as it were, out of the swirling, untidy flux of the story world. In the case of Islam, this is a good description of the processes that produce the secondary literature, certainly the Sunnah of the Prophet, the Hadith literature. There was a huge swell of accounts moving through the story world of the early Muslims concerning the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. We need not assume that any of them are historical in the first instance. Rather, they are stories. They are the stuff of the story world. In large measure, a heritage of earlier stories, folk tales, proverbs and parables and the like were absorbed into this swell. Tales concerning wise and pious words and deeds became attached to the Prophet's name. The person, the character of the Prophet became a locus for this material. This continued for a considerable length of time, across several generations in fact, before it was collected, sifted and written down, the Hadith literature emerging out of the story world. For general purposes, we can say that Muhammad is as historical as King Arthur. Both the romance of Islam and Arthurian romance are a product of the Dark Age imagination, which is to say an age in which the story world is alive but invisible and dark to us. Most likely both figures were Dark Age warlords in their historical form, but they are primarily creations of the story world. This is to say, they are essentially creations of literature, first oral and then written. To be unduly concerned with historicity is to misunderstand the process and the very nature of the case. Neither Muhammad nor Arthur ought to be considered first and foremost as historical beings. The grain of history is of little consequence compared to the sacred history written over it. The Prophet and his companions are Arthur and his knights. It is a pity we fail to make this parallel anymore. We commonly think of Muhammad and his monotheist movement as historical and Arthur as legendary, but that is a very modern historicised view of Islam. In the story world, for most of the last 1400 years, the Prophet and his companions, their words and their deeds, were figures in a sacred romance, just as Jesus was rarely perceived as historicised, except theologically incarnate, in the Christian imagination until the modern era. The Christian story world, far more than the Islamic story world, was shaped and transmitted in visual narratives, paintings, icons, frescoes, illuminations. The story world was fed by a picture world. The Islamic story world, on the other hand, was not pictorial. Islam is a prolongation of the essentially oral world of the nomad. When the story world comes to be written down, imagination in an important sense ends. The story world is a world of memories held in a matrix of imagination. Although there is then a textual imagination, the hermeneutical encounter with the text, it crystallizes, then there's a long meditation on the crystal. An example of the story world in action can be seen in accounts of the Christian monk Bahira, who figures in early Muslim biographies of Muhammad. According to the story, Muhammad, 12 years old, was travelling with a trading caravan into Syria when he was observed by this monk, who, we are told, recognized him as the long-awaited prophet. As the caravan moved through the desert, it is said, Bahira watched as a white cloud hovered and shaded the boy from the fierce sun, a sign of divine favour. Upon inspection, the monk discovered the mark of prophecy, a birthmark between the boy's shoulder blades, to confirm it. Bahira informed the boy that he was the fulfillment of ancient prophecy and would grow up to be a great lawgiver. At this point, though, Muhammad asked how this could be, since he did not have a book, as did other prophets like Jesus and Moses. Bahira, we are told, then instructed Muhammad and told him that he would teach him the Quran at night, and Muhammad could report it to his people during the day. In this way, sources say, the Prophet first realized his mission, and in this way brought his book, the Quran, to men. The full story survives in Syrian sources, but is carefully edited in Muslim accounts. It is clearly a story from the early Muslim story world. Elements of it persist into the formal edifice of Islam. It is enough, in any case, for many people throughout the centuries and into modern times to suppose that it reports an historical reality, namely that Muhammad, an illiterate Bedouin, created a new religion out of Christian instruction, taking the teachings of this Bahira and adapting them to his own preaching. In this account, here are the origins of Islam. But the story of Bahira is indeed a product of the story world. The story world can be seeded with historical data, but historicity is beside the point. The story really reflects the biblical story of Jesse and David. The parallels are quite clear. It is an anointing story. The motif of the white cloud is also biblical. The white cloud of mercy shaded the Israelites on their journey to the Promised Land. In fact, every single element of the Bahira story can be traced to earlier models. To suppose that there was an historical Muhammad who met an historical Bahira, and there was an historical exchange of information and instruction that spawned the new religion, is to confuse literature for history. Even if we suspect an historical kernel of some form, we misunderstand the story unless we treat it as exactly that, a story, and unless we understand that stories impart truths that go beyond the cold facts of history. Indeed, you cannot understand religion at all if you cannot appreciate the ways in which fictions can tell the truth. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is profoundly true, but it is, of course, entirely fictitious. There was no such man as Raskolnikov. Dostoevsky made him up. This doesn't make Dostoevsky a liar, it makes him a storyteller. It is said Dostoevsky got the idea from a report in a newspaper, but this historical kernel is altogether irrelevant to the novel that grew out of it. The point of the Bahira tale is to place Muhammad in the context of biblical prophecy. Much the same is true of the Quranic revelation. According to Muslim accounts, the angel Jibreel appeared to Muhammad and told him to read. Muhammad objected that he could not read. The angel shook him and opened his heart to the divine message, and so the Quran, the sacred recitation, began. The encounter gave rise to the first portion of Surah 96, universally believed by Muslims to be the first revelation Prophet Muhammad received. But in fact, the entire encounter, and the words recorded in the Quran at this point, is formed out of the much older story of Isaiah from the Hebrew Scriptures, who was also commanded to read. The story is an artifact formed from the expectation that the new prophet Muhammad was as much a prophet as the prophets of old. It is in any case to be understood as a product of the story world. Muslim piety regards it as an historical event, the divine intrusion into history. The story crystallizes as an historical claim. Outside of Muslim piety, we concede that it is clearly a product of the story world. These stories solidify, as it were. Muslim piety identifies the very place, a cave outside of Mecca, where this encounter between angel and man took place. That is a sacred geography, and should not be confused with a merely historical reality. The story world is projected onto both a time and a place. This is not to say there is no history, nor to say that such stories are empty of historical process. The story of Bahira, for example, surely signals continuity with the Syrian Christian tradition. It is no doubt true that what took shape as Islam, and this happened at a much later date than pious Muslim narratives admit, took a great deal from forms of Christianity then current on the edges of the late Greco-Roman world. It is not as though Islam emerged out of nowhere, but as its constituent elements moved through the story world of late antiquity, we are at a loss to retrace its steps. Ideas move underground. The most potent ideas move underground. Again, this is not a random process. The story world has its laws. In fact, it is more coherent than the world of texts. When an oral story changes and metamorphizes with the retelling, it does so in meaningful ways. When a scribe reproduces a text, scribal error enters in, and such errors are unintelligent and random mistakes rather than transformations or adaptations. Storytellers don't make mistakes. They embroider, they blend, they exaggerate, they take liberties, they impose symmetries, but they don't make mistakes. In the case of Islam, we can identify a substantial and potent body of story going back to the early Christian period that was undoubtedly the matrix in which Islam in its essential features formed. We must apply the same structures to the Christian religion too, leaving aside its historical claims, that is, its claims that its sacred history is history. It is essentially a cosmos of elements that congealed out of a story world, in its case the story world of Second Temple Judaism and its encounter with the Greco-Roman world. Story worlds, of course, have historical context. We are always dealing with the relationship between story and history, and it's an interesting question why certain religions insist on being historical while others don't. But that relationship is more subtle and deeper in its implications than most people appreciate. In the settlement of Rabbinic Judaism and Roman Christianity that emerged out of the ferment of the story world, there was a further possibility left unrealized. We might call this the Jewish Christian position. Like Christianity, it opens the one God of the Jews to the Gentiles without exception. But like Judaism, it retains aspects of the law, circumcision, prohibition of swine meat, and so forth. This viewpoint is recorded in Christian texts as an early possibility. In the New Testament, there are characters who espouse this position. In the Christian stories, the character of Paul, type of all-purpose character who can be all things to all men, thwarts this possibility, insisting that Christ fulfilled and therefore abrogates the old laws of Moses. There are certain passages in the New Testament concerning a James, the brother of Jesus, it says in these stories, who presents a very close prefiguring of what became the Islamic position centuries later. The connections between these manifestations, though, are largely unknown, underground, lost and hidden, passes through the story world for several centuries. It travels to trading centres on the fringe like Mecca. We can never track these movements. The Quran itself gives us a good analogy. This is the symbol of the hoopie bird, a bird famed for being able to detect subterranean water in the desert, a bird of great interest to desert-dwelling people, no doubt. Water in the Quran is analogous to revelation. Like water in the desert, it travels underground, deep and hidden, only emerging at the surface in occasional waterholes and springs. This is exactly the topographical symbolism of Mecca, where, the story goes, Ishmael and Hagar discovered the Well of Zamzam. That is to say, that is a point where the story world comes to the surface. It matters that we give priority to the story world. Our hardened historical Muhammad is diminished by being demythologized. In the story world, his night journey on the Burak is far more important than the historical authenticities of his supposed letters to rulers of the world. The story world is alive to symbols. History is sclerotic. A living religion, in its inception anyway, is a grand narrative, as we call it, or, as I call it more properly, a cosmos, an order containing all things needful, all things necessary. Islam hardens into an official history at a relatively late date, and the early history is backwritten. This is why there's no archaeology of the Prophet's Mosque. There was no Prophet's Mosque. In fact, the very institution of the mosque, organised religion, was later retrospectively endorsed by volumes of hadith. We shouldn't be too surprised by this. It is only surprising because it is only recently that scholars, Western scholars largely, have made critical studies of the historical veneer. Islam is not nearly as historical as it looks, but neither is Christianity. There is more litero in litero-historic than is supposed. That type of historical research we call deconstruction, but it at least has the virtue of drawing attention to the story world. When the archaeologists and the historians have finished deconstructing the early history of Islam, what we are left with, as always, is a body of stories. In its historical shape, it would seem that whoever Muhammad might have been, there emerged a nascent community of monotheists in Dark Age Arabia. In the beginning, they didn't even call themselves Muslims, and there was as yet no such edifice recognizable as Islam. The Quran was fluid, if it existed at all. It was all a much longer process than the official histories allow. Much later, a sacred history was written over it. Assuredly, that later history served the political purposes of the Islamic empires, but its interests were essentially spiritual all the same. It served to encode and preserve metaphysical foundations, first and foremost. Those with no sensitivity to the religious spirit can only see cynical machinations, but that is a caricature of the true process involved. There are those who call Herodotus the father of lies because he was sensitive to the story world. He liked a good story. He thought a historian should account for the story world. The modern historian, with pretenses to science, will have none of this, whereas the study of religions is the study of grand narratives, each a cosmos or a microcosm of the deepest and most abiding human concerns. And there are even bigger stories. The Arthurian romance, the Grail stories are, we say, a cycle. There are cycles of stories. The story world is framed by expanding cycles of narrative. Islam places itself within the great cycle of Abrahamic stories, a cycle in which the Jewish, Christian and Islamic narratives are all participating subsets. This too is a coherent cosmos with its own internal logic and metaphysical and cosmological cogency. The only important fact about the Quran is that God spoke. God adopted human language. The breath of God took that form. That is the miracle of the Quran, as it is said. The numinous congeals into human language. It makes speech per se divine. It sanctifies language as such. Every utterance being from Allah, it is immeasurably deep. At the same time, it is probably developed from a Syriac lectionary of a Jewish, Christian or Ebionitic character taken into Arabic by memorization and reinterpreted through the lens of Arabic in a new community, which is to say, a new story world. Very likely, the story of Bahira the monk reflects this textual transmission. It is a curious story in the form preserved in Syrian sources, the story of Bahira the monk. It has Bahira confirm young Muhammad's prophethood, and yet it says Muhammad taught him the Quran, which Muhammad then passed off as his own. This is Christian polemic. It is the accusation of plagiarism. The Hadith literature contains accounts of Muhammad contending with his contemporaries who accused him of plagiarizing the Quran, challenging him to produce verses on request. These accounts don't reflect historical events so much as conditions or self-reflections in the story world. The story world personifies things. Take away Bahira and Muhammad. The story is true inasmuch as it says, oral traditions from Syriac Christianity entered nascent Islam, Hijazi monotheism, and formed the raw materials for what took shape as the Quranic recitations. We have to be agnostic about ever understanding the fullness of these formative processes. We can't be scientific about it. The story world isn't like that. It opens for a start into the imaginal, not just the imaginative. Some human imaginings are not just phantoms of the mind as we tend to think of them. They say there are 7 levels of interpretation for every word of the Quran. The story world is multi-layered like that, like currents in an ocean. Science is only concerned with surfaces and the visible waves. Or we might use topographical and geophysical metaphors. At the deepest level of the story world there is magma and tectonic plates. Islam was certainly volcanic in its eruptions into history. None of this is to say that Islam is not an encounter with the divine, but in this the story of Muhammad and the angel Jibril has the same cogency as the night journey, being essentially visionary and shamanic. The sacred history that constitutes orthodoxy is not inexact. On the contrary, it constitutes, we might say, a spiritual technology, a complete cosmos. A cosmos is a path. It gives a history for the historically minded. But this serves a higher perspective in which the only thing that matters is the existential imperative of salving the human soul. The Buddhists talk of skillful means. In the case of Islam, this takes a distinctly communitarian and legalistic form, finally presenting itself as a divine revision of Jewish law and settling into a body of jurisprudence that also has its roots in the story world more than in the written text from which it is more formally extrapolated. Technically speaking, it looks back to the covenant of Noah. Islam re-establishes an old equilibrium in the Abrahamic cycle. We see it embodied in Islamic art early, the thread of the calligraphic text and the weave of crystalline structures. These matters are in the end philosophical. We are always directed to one of the central concerns of Plato, the relationship between Muthos and Logos, the story and the reasoned account. It is a complex relationship with profound implications. Applied to religions, especially, these concerns expose the unfathomable nature of the human spirit and its volcanic creativity when it turns to ultimate things. The depths of the story world are inherently mysterious. You can't calculate the reality of human activity, nor can you calculate all the streams and tributaries that converge into a religion. Every calculation ends in infinity. In the face of a theophany, everything is reimagined and brought into a cosmic order with transcendent ends. There is the intrusion of the eternal. Scientific historical studies can only reveal part of the picture, and hardly the important part. The important material moves like water through underground rivers, some of it from very ancient aquifers, very deep in the bedrock.